It works. Oh my gosh. Okay. Good morning and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Princeton, where in our open and welcoming community, we live our message of hope, love, justice, and joy. We extend a special welcome to our visitors this morning. We're glad you're here and invite you to stop by our welcome table after worship in Robinson Lounge so we can answer your questions and get to know you a little bit. Again, welcome to our congregation. We're very happy you've joined us. An announcement. We've been waiting for this all year, especially people who have a lot of junk in their house. Spring sale is this coming up Friday and Saturday. This is our biggest annual social justice fundraiser and community event. Everybody knows that all the money that comes in from spring sale goes out to local charities. And we had, I don't know if they're going to be able to post them this year, but they had posted the banners for a lot of the charities that money goes out to. Kathy Fedorko, Margie Stockwell, and the receiving team will begin accepting donations around 12:30 this afternoon, depending on how quickly we can get the booths and receiving areas set up. Today, right after the service, we need everyone who is able to help us move furniture in Channing and Robinson Lounge and set up tables for the sale. All these chairs get piled up on the sides and we make a huge space. I'm not sure if they're going to do it this year, but in the past, they've actually taken this whole podium area apart, made space up here. Terry Hyatt, Kathy Barracogan, and Amanda Gillum will direct the upstairs setup activities, and Kirsten Scherer will direct the downstairs setup. And there's racks downstairs in the lounge downstairs that have to come up into the lounge too. So we need people with muscles to do this. Thank you in advance. Oh yes, and be sure to come to the sale. Okay. For our chalice lighting, I live my life in ever-widening circles that reach out across the world. I may not complete this last one, but I give myself to it. I circle around God, around that primordial tower. I've been circling for thousands of years, and I still don't know, am I a falcon, a storm, or a great song? That's by Rilke, of course.
Dear beloveds, let us remember that we are not the sole generation, but only one of many. Let us know both the comfort and the chiding of the 7 generations of the Haudenosaunee, that we should work for a sustainable world, not just in our lifetime, but for 7 generations down. The chiding that we are responsible for that 7th generation just as much as the first. And the comfort that we receive the strength of ancestors who never even met our grandparents, let alone us. Let us remember that Bayard Rustin himself, in his own lifetime, saw both periods of progress and periods of reaction. Let us grieve that it is in some ways our time to live and work and love in this period of reaction. But let us joy in knowing that in other ways we live in a period of progress our ancestors could not have dreamed of. Let us sit in the accurate knowledge that we will not see the work done in our lifetimes because the work is never quite done. But to quote the writer Tim Minear, let us meditate upon the fact that if in the big cosmic sense, nothing we do matters, that all that matters is what we do.
So instead of presenting a personal reflection, I decided to read 2 poems today, one by Rumi and one by Rilke. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to read each poem twice. Because the first time you kind of get a feel for it, and the second time you say, oh yeah, right, he's really talking about that. First one by Rumi. It's about community of the spirit. There is a community of the spirit. Join it and feel the delight of walking in a noisy street and being the noise. Drink all your passion and be a disgrace. Close both eyes to see with the other eye. Open your hands if you want to be held. Sit down in this circle. Quit acting like a wolf and feel the shepherd's love filling you. At night, your beloved wanders. Don't accept consolations. Close your mouth against food. Taste the lover's mouth in yours. You moan, she left me, he left me. 20 more will come. Be empty of worrying and think of who created thought. Why do you stay in prison with the door so wide open? Move outside the tangle of fear thinking. Live in silence. Flow down and down in always widening rings of being. Just sit with that for a second. Now I'm going to read the whole thing again. Okay, here we go. Second time through. There is a community of the spirit. Join it and feel the delight of walking in the noisy street and being the noise. Drink all your passion and just be a disgrace. Close both eyes to see with the other eye. Open your hands if you want to be held. Sit down in this circle. Quit acting like a wolf and feel the shepherd's love filling you. At night, your beloved wanders. Don't accept consolations. Close your mouth against food and taste the lover's mouth in yours. You moan, she left me, he left me. 20 more will come. Be empty of worrying. Think who created thought. Why do you stay in prison with the door wide open? Move outside the tangle of fear thinking. Live in silence. Flow down and down in always widening rings of being. Rumi is just amazing, so heart-centered. And the second poem I want to read is by Rilke. And the name of this is For the Sake of a Single Poem. And when he's talking about the sake of a single poem, he's using that sort of as an allegory for gathering and evolving, developing wisdom. So it's kind of the gist of it. Oh, and he uses the word God in a lot of his poems. And I personally may disagree, or let's say not disagree so much as have a different concept of what God means for me personally. But because Rilke is the poet here, I'm using the word God. It's in German, and he uses the word Gott, which means God. So I will use that word, and I'm just saying, suggesting that you interpret that as however you would interpret that word. I say that because that's a difficult word for a lot of people. It can mean so many different things. For the sake of a single poem. Poems amount to so little when you write them too early in your life. You ought to wait and gather sense and sweetness for a whole lifetime, and a long one if possible. And then at the very end, you might perhaps be able to write 10 good lines. For poems are not, as people think, simply emotions. One has emotions early enough. They are experiences. For the sake of a single poem, you must see many cities, many people and things. You must understand animals. You must feel how birds fly and know the gesture of small flowers as they're opening in the morning. You must be able to think back to streets in unknown neighborhoods, to unexpected encounters, and to partings you had long seen coming, to days of childhood whose mystery is still unexplained, to parents whom you had to hurt when they brought you a joy and you didn't pick it up. It was a joy meant for someone else. To childhood illnesses that began so strangely with so many profound and difficult transformations, to days in quiet, restrained rooms and to mornings by the sea, to the sea itself, to seas, to nights of travel that rushed along high overhead and went flying with all the stars. And it's still not enough to be able to think of all that. You must have memories of many nights of love, each one different from all the others. Memories of women screaming in labor and of light, pale, sleeping girls who have just given birth and are closing again. But you must also have been beside the dying, must have sat beside the dead in the room with the open window and the scattered noises. And it is not yet enough to have memories. You must to be able to forget them when there are many, and you must have the immense patience to wait until they return, for the memories themselves are not important, only when they have changed into your very blood, into glance and gesture, and are nameless, no longer to be distinguished from themselves. Only then can it happen that in some very rare hour, the first word of a poem arises in their midst and goes forth from them. I have to read that again. For the sake of a single poem by Rainier Marie Rilke. Poems amount to so little when you write them too early in your life. You ought to wait and gather sense and sweetness for a whole lifetime, and a long one if possible. And then at the very end, you might perhaps be able to write 10 good lines. For poems are not, as people think, simply emotions, and one has emotions early enough. They are experiences. For the sake of a single poem, you must see many cities, many people and things. You must understand animals, must feel how birds fly, and know the gesture of small flowers that they make when they open in the morning. You must be able to think back to streets in unknown neighborhoods, to unexpected encounters, and to partings you had long seen coming, to days of childhood whose mystery is still unexplained, to parents whom you had to hurt when they brought you in a joy and you didn't pick it up. It was obviously a joy meant for someone else. To childhood illnesses that began so strangely with so many profound and difficult transformations, to days in quiet, restrained rooms and to mornings by the sea, to the sea itself, to all the seas, to nights of travel that rushed along high overhead and went flying with all the stars. I'm going to read that again. To nights of travel that rushed along high overhead and went flying with all the stars. Oh, I love that line. And it's still not enough to be able to think of all that. You must have memories of many nights of love, each one different from all the others. Memories of women screaming in labor and of light, pale, sleeping girls who have just given birth and are closing again. But you must also have been beside the dying, must have sat beside the dead in the room with the open window and the scattered noises. And it is not yet enough to have memories. You must be able to forget them when they are many. And you must have the immense patience to wait until they return. For the memories themselves are not important, only when they have changed, only when they have changed into our very blood, into glance and gesture, and are nameless, no longer to be distinguished from ourselves. Only then can it happen that in some rare, very rare hour, the first word of a poem arises and goes forth from them. Rilke.
Thank you, Joelle. Thank you, Asher. That was beautiful. Good morning. This homily, as you can see, is a little unusual. My name is Emma Moore, and as you can see, I am not Carol Watchler, who's originally supposed to give this homily. Unfortunately, Carol is still COVID isolating today, but thankfully feeling much better. I was already happy to do this morning's meditation, but I feel very honored that Carol entrusted me with her words. I was enthusiastic to learn even more about Bayard Rustin, but I also feel a special connection to him as we were, as some of you may know, both raised in the Quaker faith tradition. So I hope I do justice to both his spirit and to Carol's words. And here we go. Each morning, I speak my daily litany. That includes looking to all who have gone before me, family members and dear ones who have completed their moments of acting on this earth. It gives me the chance to reflect on the reality that I stand on the shoulders of so many. And I think it is powerful to call to mind the ones who have moved the direction of our human project forward towards the beloved community and who have left us with inspiration to carry it even further. Clearly, to my mind, a great forerunner to come to know and to be inspired by is Bayard Rustin. You've heard a little bit of what his courage and determination made visible earlier in Reverend Jennifer's story. Who is this icon of civil rights and human rights who was lost to history for so long? Why is he receiving greater visibility today? Why is his spirit so visible in the protesters across this country? Bayard Rustin should not have been obscured to the greater world for so long because he planned the 1963 March on Washington. Bayard Rustin brought nonviolence to the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. Bayard Rustin inspired the Freedom Riders. But Bayard Rustin was edited out of so many stories because of whom he loved and who he was, a queer Black man embracing his identity. We learned in the story hour that Bayard Rustin was deeply committed to nonviolent resistance. You could hear that his firm belief led him to take action and take a risk. You saw that this action did lead to a racially motivated negative response, but that he inspired some folks purely by his firm commitment. And this was way back in 1942, in the days of Jim Crow laws, barring African Americans from having equal treatment and from receiving acknowledgement of their dignity as human beings. Bayard Rustin was determined to make visible with nonviolent resistance every place where injustice needed to be eradicated, even and especially in the laws and policies of this land. Later on, attesting to his profound commitment to nonviolence, he resisted conscription into war and served time in federal prison. While in prison, he worked as hard as he could, using communications with the prison authorities to integrate the racially segregated prison facility. That kind of communication with the temporal authority was always an important part of his strategy. And this was all before he challenged the Jim Crow law allowing segregated interstate travel. To test the implementation of the 1946 Supreme Court ruling striking down this law, he invited an interracial group of persons seeking action against racial injustice to carry out the journey of reconciliation through Southern states in 1947. This is well before, decades before the Freedom Rides of 1961 that many of us learned about in our history books, in which included vicious assaults on folks such as John Lewis. Bayard Rustin was deeply involved in the struggle for peace and the struggle for human rights. In the 1950s, after the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision calling for an end to segregated schools, Rustin was a primary organizer of the youth marches for integrated schools in Washington, D.C. He then became acquainted with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and worked with him to organize the prayer pilgrimage for freedom. Rustin recognized King's oratorical gifts and his charisma, as well as his platform for reaching people as a minister in the South. Bayard Rustin became a mentor and collaborator with King in these critical communications as King connected with local, state, and federal authorities during the Montgomery bus boycott, leading to the federal civil rights legislation that ultimately passed Congress in the 1960s. We know Bayard Rustin best for his role in organizing the 1963 March on Washington, which he knew must be organized as a march for freedom and for jobs. He knew it must be a call that reached across not only the lives of Black Americans struggling for their civil rights and their civic dignity, but also for the greater American and global struggle for economic well-being. We also know that leading role did not come easily to him. The civil rights movement at the time had a panoply of visible leaders who came together, acknowledging that the strategy of the march was an action whose time had come. These leaders included Martin Luther King, representing the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Roy Wilkins, representing the NAACP, James Farmer, leader of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, Whitney M. Young of the Urban League, John Lewis with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and A. Philip Randolph, the trade union leader who founded the Union of Sleeping Car Porters and had envisioned a huge march way back in the early 1940s. A. Philip Randolph had taken Bayard Rustin under his wing and had witnessed his skill in organizing firsthand. But the Big Six, as they were known, were not all in agreement that Bayard Rustin should lead the march. What would it be like if the press got a hold of his background with the Young Communist League in his student days, or even the morals charge on the books more recently in California? What would the press and other naysayers come up with if Rustin were at the front of the organizing? And mind you, this was before the challenge of social media. Ultimately, A. Philip Randolph was chosen as the march coordinator, and he wisely chose Bayard Rustin as his deputy. Thus, Rustin had the responsibility, if not the credit, for the incredible challenge of choreographing this event. I mean, imagine calling the nation to Washington, D.C., finding commitments from folks across the country, gathering buses and cars and train fare, food, directions for where to gather. And imagine finding inspiration to do this in a non-violent way, knowing that Black brothers and sisters and non-binary siblings were being harassed and often tortured with racist laws, policies, attitudes, and actions across the South and across the whole country. Imagine managing the press, the order of speakers, where there was clearly some competition in play, and ensuring that the National Mall had all systems go for a big crowd of then indeterminate size. We know now that this was a high point in the civil rights movement, but for Rustin and his fellow activists, it only set the stage for the real work that lay ahead. A further nonviolent protest march in the spirit of Bayard Rustin followed in 1965, the Selma March to the State House in Montgomery, Alabama. It was organized by nonviolent activists to demonstrate the desire of African-American citizens to exercise their constitutional right to vote in defiance of segregationist repression. They were part of a broader voting rights movement underway in Selma and throughout the American South. The first attempt at leaving Selma, crossing the Pettus Bridge, was halted by violent law enforcement. Wide publicity and plans to try again brought allies and activists from other parts of the country, including Unitarian Universalists who had been stepping up throughout the civil rights movement. A group of ministers, including James Reeb, a UU parish minister from Boston, were attacked by local Alabamans stewing in their resentment of whites and others coming from the outside. Reeb was hospitalized after suffering a brutal assault and died days later. Martin Luther King said of him, quote, "James Reeb says something to each of us, Black and white alike, says that we must substitute courage for caution, says to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered him, but about the system and the way of life." And we must remember that James Reeb was inspired to that great sacrifice, not just by his own conscience, but by the work of the years before Selma, the work not only of King, but of many, many undersung activists like Bayard Rustin. But Bayard Rustin himself did not see the triumphs of the civil rights movement just as an end, but as a beginning. Much of his activism was focused on the movement for civil rights, economic justice, and peace. But as the man himself said, quote, "You have to join every other movement for the freedom of people." As the 1970s went on, that statement came home to him in a very personal way. Bayard Rustin never denied that he was gay, living his personal and professional life as an out gay man. However, it took until the 1980s, with the loving pressure of his partner, Walter Nagel, for him to add gay rights advocate to his activist identity. But he then embraced it with the energy with which he embraced all struggles against injustice. He testified to the New York legislature in 1986 on behalf of the New York Gay Rights Bill, stating that, quote, gay people are the social barometer of our time, unquote. The barometers may change decade by decade, but the urgency of creating that better world, that beloved community that Bayard Rustin dreamed of, does not. The movement does not end. The movement does not end. It merely transforms. We see, or we should see, daily continued gathering in protest against racism and other forms of injustice. Tens of thousands of people gathered in peaceful protest following the murder of George Floyd. And just recently, just this past month, students gathered in nonviolent protest in Nashville, Tennessee, to protest the inaction of their legislature to pass gun safety legislation. They were supported in protest by 3 courageous representatives, Justin Pearson, Justin Jones, and Gloria Johnson, who risked their seats in the governing body and raised their voices despite so many attempts by the leaders of the Tennessee legislature to silence them. And this past week, we've seen Zoe Zephyr, our trans sister, being silenced in her role as Montana legislator representative for the city of Missoula, as Zoe expressed her conviction against the deadly anti-trans healthcare bill that the Assembly, sadly, has just passed. Zoe was silenced for joining her voice with nonviolent protesters in the Montana State House. But the spirit of Bayard Rustin, being clear on standing for justice for all, being a leader in galvanizing nonviolent resistance to injustice and risking one's freedom, even one's life, to work for freedom for all, is visible today. And it is a call to us, resonating with our UU values of interdependence, equity, transformation, pluralism, generosity, and justice, all melted together in the cauldron of love. We ask ourselves how we are called as we hear Bayard Rustin's insistence echoing through the years that, quote, "We need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers." May it be so, and amen. And at the end of this hour, we extinguish our chalice, knowing that its light carries us until we gather again. Go forth grateful for the moments before you, the breath within you, the people among you, and the spirit guiding you towards lives of greater love, beauty, and kindness. And go forth knowing that you are held always, and always with neighbor and stranger by that great love of no beginning and never ending. Go in peace, and amen.